One of the most important factors in gardening successfully is choosing the right plant. Today we visit with an industry expert and discuss some practical ways that you can do just that. You won't want to miss it, so stay tuned as we garden smart from North Carolina.
The Safer brand organic lawn care program makes house calls. By ordering online, the lawn you want can be delivered right to your door. The Safer brand organic lawn care program is a proud sponsor of public television and GardenSMART.
I should be arrested for crimes against potted plant kind. My house is where plants came to die.
Miracle Grow potting mix is designed to help grow big, beautiful plants. Everyone grows with Miracle Grow.
Hey there, little Red Riding Hood. You sure are looking good.
Wilmington, North Carolina was settled by Europeans in the early 1700s and has been an important port city dating back to the Civil War. Today, it's a Coast Guard city and has also been named one of the dozen distinctive destinations by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Its vibrant Riverwalk district is home to restaurants, arts, music, and unique shops. Just a few blocks from the water is the home of Barbara Sullivan, who's an avid gardener as well as the well-known author of Garden Perennials of the Coastal South. Originally from New Jersey, Barbara returned to her husband's family home in Wilmington and soon thereafter took to transforming her backyard into a coastal paradise. Her years of experience culminated in her book that has been widely recognized as the definitive reference manual on coastal gardening. Today we'll discuss with Barbara how we go about finding the plants that will give us the best results regardless of where our garden happens to be. Today we're at the home of avid gardener and author Barbara Sullivan. Barbara, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you. Barbara, what brought you and your family to Wilmington?
Well, my husband originally grew up here in Wilmington. We were both working as attorneys in Washington, D.C., and he came here to join his father's law firm.
So what got you interested in gardening?
Well, I didn't know I was interested, but we bought a house in Washington, and I became fascinated with an ad in the back of Parade magazine, and I sent away for something like 39 plants for a total of $24. So you have to imagine it was a different era. And when they arrived, all 39 of them arrived in a manila envelope, which was, since I didn't know anything about gardening or plants, I thought, well, that's unusual. I didn't know what to expect, but that wasn't quite what I expected. Basically, the instructions were you must plant us immediately. So I enlisted my mother and father-in-law, and we got out soup spoons and serving spoons and whatever we had handy, and we just stuck them any which way in the garden because it didn't occur to me that you might have to decide where to plant a plant.
Right.
I didn't really know anything. I didn't own any gardening tools. And that's what we did. We just stuck them all around and they all came up, and I had corn that was that tall, and I had raspberries, and I had various plants which I didn't know the name of at the time, probably daisies and carnations and a little teeny weeny pink dogwood, and it was fun, and it was fun to see them come up like that.
So you went on from there to write a book about plants that do particularly well in the coastal southeast. What can you tell me about that process?
Well, basically I had been experimenting with different plants. Mostly I'd been reading books that were written for gardeners up in the northeastern area, I would say, or England, which I loved. But I wasn't having perfect success, and I went to a symposium in Charleston, South Carolina, which has climate similar to ours, and there were garden writers and designers and famous people in the gardening world from Ireland and England and Colorado, and really places with climates that are not similar to ours. And the audience members were giving feedback saying, the plants that you're showing us do not really do well here. The books that were out there, there were some about the South, but they would talk about they would include the mountains as well as the coastal area. So then I realized there was no book, and I just decided I would write the book. I'm not really sure why or how, I just did, and that's what I did. And I researched. I went from Norfolk, Virginia, down to Jacksonville, Florida, in my car with my camera, and I met with experts and visited nurseries and gardens and things, and then I also went along the Gulf Coast.
Well, so your garden is a collection of some of the most successful plants and probably some others that you're trialing to see whether or not they're going to make it. So I think it'll be a wonderful place to tour and something really neat for our viewers to see.
Okay, great.
Barbara, you have a beautiful home. Tell me a little bit about the history of it.
Well, it was built in 1871 by William French, who was a shoe merchant in Wilmington, and we bought it about 32 years ago, I believe.
Wow. So what was here when you bought the house?
Well, when we first bought the house, the backyard was basically an empty rectangle. The magnolias were here. There was a little bit of chain link fencing here and there. There was no porch, and there were a few camellias in the back, and then behind the camellias was kind of a weedy, no man's land place that we couldn't get into, full of brambles and stuff.
For most gardeners that I know, they don't approach a space thinking, well, I'm going to build this giant, elaborate garden.
Right.
For myself, I started with just the space right by my front door, and then it grew into, where now I have no turf.
Right, exactly.
So how did things get started?
That seems to happen. Yeah, who knew? I certainly had no idea it would end up like this at all. Well, I just loved gardening. As I've said, I just became kind of really interested in it. And I didn't have time. I had small children, and so there wasn't a whole lot of time to garden. So I started off with a very small plot, about maybe 6 feet by 2 feet, literally a little rectangle, and I put everything in there. And that was my first garden.
Barbara, from your initial 6 foot by 2 foot plot, now your garden encompasses the entirety of your backyard. Was there a plan that you put in place, or how did you conceive of this?
Well, there wasn't really a plan, but basically I took the 6 foot garden and made it maybe 10 foot. I put some railroad ties in, and it was a raised bed for a while. And that was fine as far as it went, and mostly I did that because my husband wasn't sure. He wanted me digging things up. He wasn't sure about this whole gardening idea.
Yeah.
But he and I went and visited a lot of really beautiful gardens, and at one point he came back, he said, ours doesn't really look like the others. I said, I know, because we need to do more. We need to branch out. I said, how about if I just put a little rim around the edge of the whole thing? And he's like, oh, okay, but don't make it very deep. So I made this narrow little, actually I made it deeper than what we had agreed on. And so for a long time there was a border around the edge, which was very nice, and then a big green lawn in the middle. And it was also good for the children to be able to play and have birthday parties and things like that.
Sure.
And but it was sort of felt a little bit static, because you come out and there it is. It's just, you kind of see the whole thing, boom. And at some point we built a porch, as I said, so that you'd have a little view from the porch. And at one point when I was on vacation, I read a book called Romantic Gardens, and I just became completely inspired, or carried away, I guess you would say. And I said to my husband, I'm going to do something pretty wild. And he's like, okay, go ahead. I said, no, really, really wild. And he said, go ahead, just do it. And so that's when this idea came about, which was to sort of the beginning of what you see now today.
You've got basically berms or raised beds. I'm assuming you had to bring in a lot of soil to build those. How did that happen?
I did, yes. Basically, first of all, I decided to put it on an axis, because that seemed like it would give it more energy, rather than, on a diagonal axis, I should say, rather than a straight crisscross. And then I got 2 10-ton truckloads, which is not easy to say, of dirt delivered out front, and I hired some nice college guys who just wheelbarrowed the dirt. We went through 2 wheelbarrows. We broke 2 wheelbarrows. We were on our 3rd by the time it was over.
Wow.
And they just, I laid out the shapes with hoses, garden hoses, and they just dumped it within the hoses. And I paid them and they left, and then I spent quite a bit of time sort of throwing myself upon the dirt and crafting, if you will, the mounds,
Sure.
which sounds a little crazy, but that's what I did.
So tell me about the hardscape. The paths are a wonderful feature in this garden.
Thank you.
How have they evolved over the years?
Originally, they were, I think, grass, if I remember correctly, and then I thought it might be good to have some pavers first. So for many, many years, there were pavers with dirt in between, which is very weed intensive and
Right.
a lot of work. So the current paths that you see now are really very new. They were put in probably last fall, and
Okay.
I love them because now I don't have to weed my paths.
I really love the scale of your garden, and as you said, you can't see everything from one spot, but it seems like the plant selections have, perhaps over the years, evolved into something that really, really fits the space well.
Thank you. Well, that is true. It has evolved because I have often given away to friends things that got too big. There are a couple of things, though, that got a lot bigger than I thought they would, but I've kept them, like the Japanese maple that's a threadleaf maple, and a gold thread false cypress that was supposed to be a dwarf 4 foot and is now maybe 30 feet, 20 feet. It's tall. So, but yes, I try to mix broad leaves and structural architectural elements like palms and some of the subtropicals in with some of the smaller plants. I think perennials are nice when they're tucked in among other things which give them structure.
Right. As a gardener, one of the subjects that I'm most interested in discussing with other gardeners are the plants that really do particularly well for them. And we have the great advantage in having you here who've done a lot of research on which plants in this area have done particularly well. I don't think most gardeners do their homework that intensively. And I'd love to talk about in terms of the year in your garden.
Sure.
And starting with spring, let's talk about some of the plants that do particularly well that time of year.
Okay.
In the coastal South.
Okay, well, I'm glad that you asked about the 4 seasons because the coastal South is a great place to garden all year round. And so I try to plant for every single season because it's fun to be out in the garden and see something blooming at all times of the year. So that's one of my big goals in designing this garden. The spring, of course, has wonderful plants. We have an azalea festival here in Wilmington, so there's lots of azaleas. Camellias do beautifully for us. Some of my favorite bulbs are Phaon, which is a teeny little bulb. It's a spring starflower. And if you plant a few of them, they will multiply, but not in a bad way. And they make a blanket, a carpet. It's just beautiful. And they look beautiful with pansies and with anemone coronaria and with dwarf narcissus. I like to use dwarf narcissus because that way the leaves, when they yellow, don't really take up a whole lot of space and visual space, I should say.
Sure. Now let's talk about summer. One thing I noticed too that I really, really like about your garden is that you've worked a lot of beautiful color into the foliage. And I think it makes the garden very interesting year round, but especially in summer when a lot of the early spring bloomers have faded. I think a lot of the dark foliage, chartreuse, those kind of really interesting colors that create contrast in the garden, you've done a really good job with.
Thank you.
What are some of the other plants that you like for summer?
Well, I love using subtropicals. I didn't used to like them for some reason, but I realized that you can't really get through summer just on perennials because perennials, some of them are wonderful and they will bloom for 10 days or 2 weeks and then maybe not look quite as great. So again, you need the structural and the subtropicals like the colocaceas and the curcumas and the hedychiums and the other subtropicals really give a lot of pow. And I think in the summer it's very hot and often very hazy here. And so I try to use some bright colors if I can and some, as you said, chartreuse. I think livens up the sort of dull green. Otherwise the garden could end up very dull green and could end up not seeming very vibrant. And I like how the subtropicals give vibrancy to the garden.
They do, and there's also a lushness and I think a coolness that the garden gets.
That's
with,
true.
Especially with big foliage plants that are interspersed with some of the fine cut leaf type plants.
I agree.
Now in fall, for me, that's a tricky time of year because you're coming out of the dog days of August. I'm in the
Right.
South also, and
Right.
and so that can be one of the more difficult seasons, I think, in some ways, to select plants for. What would you recommend?
Well, for one thing, some of the vines come into their own. You have autumn clematis. You have Thunbergia, which is the blue sky vine. A lot of vines seem to really come into their own in autumn, which is great. Of course, you can have foliage from Japanese maples, but we don't do quite as much with foliage as they would, say, somewhere
Right.
in New England. A lot of the taller plants, like the Joe Pye weed and the asters and the swamp sunflower and goldenrod, do well, and the perennial ageratum, those are back of the border plants that again come into their own in the fall. So there are a lot of perennials that really do well in the fall. And for us in particular, the roses often are at their peak in the fall, which is interesting.
So for winter, I know further north, that's a time that the garden pretty much goes dormant, and the gardener oftentimes does from the
Right.
standpoint of actively
Right.
gardening. But further south, you can, as you said, garden year-round. What are some of the plants that are particularly interesting to you that time of year?
Well, I think you have to definitely, I tell people if they can possibly put a sasanqua or a camellia in their garden, they should. You can stretch the bloom of sasanquas and camellias from the fall all the way through late in the spring, depending on which varieties you get,
Right.
and that's just really lovely to see
Sure.
in the garden.
Probably one of my favorite winter plants, and in fact, I don't know how it does here, but hellebores or Lenten rose
I
is
love
absolutely
hellebores.
fantastic that time of year.
I love hellebores. I have an area that's kind of my little winter area where I have a white quince and I have hellebores and I have a corkscrew hazel, which has lost its leaves at that point. So
Right.
you just see the wonderful corkscrew branches that are making a beautiful design.
And that is a great time of year to think about, the architecture of the garden, what these trees are going to look like when they're defoliated. And so
Absolutely.
it's a wonderful opportunity to look at exfoliating bark. I love the coral bark maple because you get those bright red stalks that are very exposed in the wintertime, and that
Right.
when they lose their leaves, there are some plants that are
That are
really
beautiful.
quite interesting, and they're almost statuesque.
Yes, I agree completely.
Barbara, one of the questions that we get from our viewers oftentimes when we're looking at a very intensely planted garden is, how in the world do they keep up with all that from a maintenance standpoint? And I want you to talk just in practical terms about your maintenance strategy.
Okay. Well, I don't have a formal plan for working in the garden a certain number of days or weeks or anything like that. I come out when I want to, and I love being out here, of course, in the spring and in the fall when it's cool, and I actually like puttering around in the winter too. And so that's just a pleasure. I'll just take one segment of the garden at a time and maybe get it fixed up and do that. In the summer, sometimes when it's really, really hot, I just won't even come out here.
Right. Let's discuss weed control. That's one of the biggest challenges for gardeners, is just that battle that constantly exists between the plants you want there and the plants that are exerting their will. on your
Right,
garden.
exactly. Well, I have plenty of those. In theory, if you can just get every square inch planted with something you want, then the other ones won't come, but that doesn't really work. But so, I pull weeds. We have a lot of pennywort, and we have all sorts of other wonderful weeds. But I also let some weeds stay. For example, violets. Some people consider violets to be weeds.
Right.
There's a plant called Jewel of Opar, which has spread itself all throughout my whole garden, and I just decided to let it stay. And I actually brought a weed in, which is evening primrose. I bought it from
Okay.
a vacant lot, and I put it everywhere, which a lot of people wouldn't do because I just think it's such a beautiful flower. So sometimes I encourage weeds if they're attractive, and they will fill in the bare spots.
Right. Do you have any issues with disease control in your garden?
Black spot is a problem with roses, so I've tried to use only roses that are immune to black spot or just about immune. If I do have to spray, I use just the products that are environmentally safe.
Sure.
I use copper or sulfur or something like that. The other thing is, if I find a plant that's really diseased and it's diseased year after year, I'll just remove it because
Right.
it's obviously not happy. And part of combating disease is to get the right plant to begin with, which is
course.
again, going back to why I wrote the book, is to make sure that you can get plants that like it here, and they tend to resist disease much better. Also plant them in the correct location, and also if you amend the soil and give them a really good growing medium, they're going to have a much better chance of resisting disease. So those are all part of the disease management. I don't believe in just using toxic chemicals just because you... And the other thing is you can let a little bit of disease coexist, that's fine, you know, as long as it's not going to completely decimate your garden.
Let me ask you this, in the heat of the summer and especially going into fall, plants need a lot of water and it gets really, really hot. What do you do for irrigation?
Well, we do have an irrigation system, but on the other hand, it's been broken many years in a row, so it works and it doesn't work. So we don't count on it, I don't count on it. What I do is the first year that I plant anything, I try to keep it watered and pay attention to it, because as you said, our summers here are as tough as the winters in Vermont. That's the way I look at it. That's the part that the plant's going to have to make it through. And so I do try to give them some extra watering their first year so that they can establish a good root system. I also, when I first plant, I use root stimulator, and that's the most important thing, is the root system. And that will help with later on with you know, the need for watering and such.
Well, I think also the berms that you built go a long way to helping with water conservation. You know, if a plant can develop a deep root system, it won't need to be watered as often and it won't require as much water. So, you know, not only is it aesthetically beautiful, but there's a wonderful water-saving functionality to the berm.
I hadn't thought of that, but that's true.
One of the final things I want to talk about today is the art that you've used in your garden. And I think we've seen examples over the years of garden art that is overdone or improperly done, and other examples where it's very tastefully done. And I think that's what we see here, is a very tasteful use of garden art.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, it's fun. I like to bring a little bit of whimsy into the garden. Both of these sculptures that you see here, the giraffe and the lizard, are done by local artists who are people that are friends of mine. And I like to have something man-made that sort of contrasts and offsets the natural plant material that's here. And also it's nice for a focal point. I think it's important for gardens to have one or two focal points so that people have some way of making sense of what they're seeing, I guess. Right.
One thing I noticed too as we were walking in, at the end of this long pathway, you've got this bright chartreuse bench, and it's actually kind of shifted over to one side, and it's inviting you to walk around the corner, but it's also drawing your eye through the garden. And I think using those kind of either hardscapes or sculpture to create points where our eyes can rest in the garden.
That's important. I think that's important.
Barbara, before we leave you, are there any sage words of advice that you have for our viewers?
Well, since I'm becoming an ancient person at this point in my life, I would say you have to be really patient. Right. And that's some of the fun of gardening, because you wait and there are things you forgot you planted and they come up and they bloom, and it's just wonderful. It's like a surprise. It's like Christmas all year round. So, but sometimes you'll have to be patient for 3 or 4 years for perennials or certain vines to bloom, and I think it's worth it. And I just like the fact that the garden is a process over time.
Right, absolutely. That's great. Barbara, thank you so much for sharing the day with us.
Thank you so much.
Your garden's beautiful. We
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you so much.
Another show, another amazing garden. We hope you've enjoyed this episode as much as we've enjoyed producing it. If you watch the show, you know we travel the country visiting beautiful gardens. Well, we have a surprise in store for several in the audience. To learn more about the surprise, visit our website at GardenSMART.com.
The Safer brand organic lawn care program makes house calls. By ordering online, the lawn you want can be delivered right to your door. The Safer brand organic lawn care program is a proud sponsor of public television and GardenSMART.
I should be arrested for crimes against potted plant kind. My house is where plants came to die.
Miracle-Gro potting mix is designed to help grow big, beautiful plants. Everyone grows with Miracle-Gro.
Hey there, little Red Riding Hood. You sure are looking good.
There's an old saying that says, as the garden grows, so grows the gardener. Today we visit a garden that's the product of decades of patience and hard work, as well as picking up some useful advice for how your garden can look great year-round. If you have questions about anything you've seen today, visit us on the web at GardenSMART.com. And remember, even if you're a master gardener, there's always more to learn. So join us next week for more great gardening tips and ideas as we garden smart.